joining our Tribal Law and Policy Institute webinar today on tribal domestic violence courts and dockets, protocols and policies. So today is our third webinar in our series on tribal domestic violence courts and dockets. And in case any of you missed one or both of the previous webinars, they are available on our tlpi.org website. Today we are recording the webinar and it will be available on our website later. And I will also email out a copy of the PowerPoint slides to everybody by Monday afternoon, and I'll try to get it earlier if possible. If you have questions, please feel free to type them in. It should be on your within your box here on the side for the webinar. Questions are from the third to the bottom. So please feel free to type in questions. We will likely just take all the questions at the end, but if you have any as you're listening, please feel free to type them in and I will be sure to get to them at the end of the webinar. Today, oh, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Chia Halpern-Vitsa with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. And if you do have any questions about the webinar today, please feel free to email me. And with that, I'd like to introduce our webinar presenters today, Bonnie Claremont, our Victim Advocacy Program Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and our other presenter, the Honorable Kelly Gaines Stoner, Victim Advocacy Legal Specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and she is also a judge at the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Chia. And hello, everybody. Thank you for attending our third in a series of 3 webinars that deal with sort of establishing and implementing a tribal domestic violence court or a tribal domestic violence docket. So to start at the beginning of this webinar number 3, we could go over the learning objectives, and just at the end of this webinar, you should be able to understand the benefits of utilizing protocols and policies, understand the development of tribal domestic violence courts and dockets protocols, and understand that as we move through this presentation today, we're sort of presupposing that you have viewed webinar 1 and 2, at least at some point before you get ready to really begin developing and structuring your tribal domestic violence court or docket, that you've already established a core team, and that you've utilized the vision statement or mission statement, I'll use those terms interactively, that have incorporated the core values that you've identified in the tribal community. So there's sort of a precursor for this, but we'll visit that issue again. And you should also be able to utilize the 8-step model. Bonnie and I have modified that just a little bit, and we'll explain those modifications to you as we move through the PowerPoint. But it is a tried and true model for developing protocols and policies, and it's very, very useful to us as we begin this journey of structuring protocols and policies for a tribal domestic violence court and docket. So what are protocols and policies? One thing that I would really like you to come away with from this presentation today is that the protocols and policies that the team eventually adopts, that is a living document. And by that I mean that this 8-step process that we're going to be speaking to you about in a few minutes really has as one of its requirements a repeat of the cycle, a repeat of the steps. And this repeat keeps happening over and over and over, sort of making a circle to where your protocols and policies will periodically and continually be monitored, evaluated, updated, and the cycle will continue, so that this living document will continue to grow and change as the tribal community's needs grows and changes. So a protocol and policy, very basically, it sets forth procedures and agreements, because it's going to be a multidisciplinary effort with the tribal domestic violence court. It's going to set forth procedures and agreements that are going to be followed by individual agencies or groups as they participate in this tribal domestic violence court or docket sort of multidisciplinary team. Also, protocols and policies are in writing. It's a plan that's put in writing for how the tribal community has identified the best way, the best practice for that tribal community, incorporating the tribe's very unique customs, traditions, and language in that plan. It also, the protocols and policies reaffirm and incorporate the vision statement or mission statement. We're going to go over what that is here in a few minutes. And core values, the two things that must be incorporated into this protocol and policy throughout. And these, the vision statement and the core values will be developed with some input from the tribal community and will target the gaps, the barriers, victim safety issue, accountability issues that are present in the tribal community. Also, continuing on with that slide, what are protocols and policies? The protocols and policies also, as you think about this and developing these, it should provide a working definition of domestic violence. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you just cut and paste the tribal code's definition or the state court's definition. It means what domestic violence is with the backdrop of tribal custom and tradition with respect to women and children and their safety, where they stood in society, and starting from there, whatever your tribal community is seeing, what issues are appearing that the tribe has identified as domestic violence, that should go into your working definition. The protocols and policies also provide a roadmap, a plan, a blueprint to the delivery of trauma-informed, victim-driven services. And I wanted to take just a second to go over with you, refresh your memory perhaps with respect to what trauma-informed services are and victim-driven services are. And trauma-informed services, as we are using this term here, is this service delivery model that all these agencies are utilizing that is grounded in an understanding that due to victimization issues, the brain has been stressed, and that has in turn possibly affected the victim's ability to make decisions, to process information. It may affect the victim's memory, recall, and it may also affect the victim's willingness to seek help. And so all of the service delivery providers in this group, this team that we're talking about, understand what trauma-informed service delivery looks like. It's very sensitive to the victim's safety and the victim's needs. And it also affects how effective the victim's service delivery is. This is a best practice now. And the good news is with trauma-informed service delivery to the victim and her children, and I'm talking about the victim of domestic violence, that trauma can be treated. It can be treated, and if not totally, substantially alleviated with trained professionals involved in the service providing arena. Also, victim-driven, you may hear this referred to, and oftentimes the terms I think are interchangeable, victim-driven and victim-centered. And I personally like the word victim-driven. What that means is that the service delivery to the victim and her children, the victim of domestic violence, is driven by the needs and concerns of the domestic violence victim himself or herself. And what happens is when you let the victim decide and make those decisions and honor those decisions about service needs and safety needs, it ensures victim empowerment, and it also increases the chance that the service providers are going to deliver compassionate and sensitive services to the victim of domestic violence in a non-judgmental manner. And I think that's really a key, is that we understand that this model that we're talking about, to this tribal domestic violence courts and dockets, all team players have to deliver trauma-informed services to the victim, and all the services must be victim-driven. It also formalizes the rules and responsibilities of collaborative partners. If any of you have ever worked in a project that seemed to be really, the success of the project is based upon who is in charge at the time, and if that person happens to depart, leave the program, then the project suffers. The rules all change when you get a new person in that position. Protocols and policies actually formalize the rules and responsibilities of all partners, present and future. Thus, I hope, minimizing the effect that a change in some of the lead roles in this team, it will alleviate the effect that departure from that team that it will have on the project itself. Also, protocols and policies help ensure the accountability of the court and the court's partners. And again, we're talking about the Tribal Domestic Violence Court. Accountability is sometimes painful. It requires a lot of self-reflection. It requires open dialogue in a safe place. It requires participation from all team members. But this team that is being put together to work on these protocols and policies must put some provision in the protocols and policies that requires the partners to be accountable to the court and the court to the partners. When we talk about the core team, and here, these are just a few. Each tribal community might look different with respect to who's going to be on the core team that's going to be working on the protocols and policies. But at a minimum, you would want judge or judges, tribal court personnel. You would definitely must have a tribal victim advocate. If you don't have a tribal victim advocate, I would reach out to my tribal coalitions. If that is not helpful, if you don't have a tribal coalition, then you might reach out to a state victim advocate, but tribal victim advocate would be your #1 choice. Tribal prosecutors, tribal law enforcement, probation, defense attorneys, and really you could select any other victim service provider that is encountering victims of domestic violence and children and providing services. Now, this core team that we went through really more, I think, more in depth in the first and second webinar, but the core team should collaboratively develop and identify, and this really needs to be done before you sit down to write the protocols and the policies. There needs to be a mission statement that has already been put in writing and approved by your core team. And the core values, I want to tell you what the mission statement is first. The mission statement encapsulates the overall goal and purpose of the Tribal Domestic Violence Court. It should really, the underpinnings of a Tribal Domestic Violence Court is a focus on victim safety and batterer accountability. So you would really want this mission statement to somehow touch on those two issues. An example might be something like this. The Tribal Domestic Violence Court will incorporate a one family, one judge concept in domestic violence cases and shall seek to utilize tribal law, custom, and tradition to promote victim safety and batterer accountability. That would be that overarching goal to where later, if there are stressful conversations among core team members, you can always go back to this mission or vision statement and say, did we all agree that these were our goals? These are our overarching goals. And so that's the common ground that the judge is able to reflect back upon if the law is ambiguous, and also the collaborative partners can use as common ground to sort of reset and start their conversations. Also, you need to have core values in place. How many you have is totally dependent upon the needs of the tribal community. But what a core value is, as we're using it in our webinar series, are these deeply held beliefs in your tribal community as they relate to healthy families, to victims, women, their children, and keeping those victims and their children safe. They should be the highest priorities. They should be fundamental forces that really don't change much over time. And these core values will drive your policies and protocols. It will drive the development of your tribal court, the tribal court and the domestic violence court and the tribal domestic violence court docket. Also, you should have in place and have reviewed confidentiality and client privacy safeguards, because this victim information, we're talking about these collaborative partners possibly sharing this information. You need to do a thorough review of the tribal code with respect to confidentiality and protections of this client information. And there will ultimately, at the conclusion of the webinar, and hopefully a few months later than that, we're going to be at some point hopefully publishing a tribal domestic violence court docket and guide, or tribal domestic violence court / docket and guide that has a series of progressive exercises for you to work on. And I think the webinars will be very complementary to the guide. So if you have questions now about what did she say to do about confidentiality and client protections of protecting client information, when the guide comes out, I think there are some really useful exercises in there that will guide you to the review and the ultimate conclusion about whether you might need more protections for client information and exactly how to address that issue. But again, these three pieces need to be in place prior to you sitting down and beginning to write your protocols and policies. With that, Bonnie, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to just continue on in what Kelly's shared so far. So this model is based on what's called an 8-step model for developing protocol, and it's one that I've done a significant amount of training on in tribal communities that are developing multi-disciplinary sexual assault response protocols. And it's been really, I think, a really useful tool. So we've also developed a resource guide sort of based on this model. And actually, it's a couple more steps in an 8-step model. We've adapted a little bit for this purpose. And I'll be sharing each of those steps with you as I continue on here. But it does utilize a cyclical approach where once the steps are completed, you go back around all of the steps again. But the next time you go through those steps, it's not as, you don't spend as much time on each one, but it's important to continue that process to see how things have changed, what needs to be improved upon, what kind of gaps still exist within the process, within you know, the DV court and how it's operating and so forth. So it is a very comprehensive tool in that sense. So these are the steps, and as you can see, there's actually 10, 9 without the last one, which is the repeat part of going back over the cycle. And this model is based on, it comes from a book that was written by Anita Boles and John Patterson. This was back in 1997. It's called Improving Community Response to Crime Victims, an 8-step model for developing protocol. And it comes out of California, out of the SAGE publication. So that's the source. And like I said, it's been utilized by tribal communities in developing sexual assault response protocols within prosecution, within advocacy, within law enforcement, within hospitals that are doing forensic exams, for example. And these are the 8 steps plus the 2 additional that we've added, and I'll discuss those as we go. So we start with the inventory of existing services, which is the first step. And this is a really important step. You know, it's really important to take inventory of existing services around domestic violence in your tribal community so that you're aware of all services and resources available to victims of domestic violence. And it also helps you determine who are the stakeholders out there that perhaps can help you develop these protocols. And it also can serve, at the end of this inventory of existing services, it also can serve as sort of a resource guide that can accompany your protocol handbook, or however you're going to incorporate all the information. And it's important to be, as comprehensive as possible, to really look at what are the services out there that domestic violence victims may come in contact with, may utilize, such as law enforcement, the prosecutor's office, medical facilities if they're, been injured, and so the more crisis kind of injuries, the more immediate kind of injuries, but also looking at more long-term injuries and how those may impact a victim of domestic violence. And also mental health programs, how are they helpful to victims of domestic violence? And other victim service organizations, if other crimes have happened along with the domestic violence, what are those service agencies in the tribal community or surrounding areas that victims may utilize to also take inventory of them? And other social service organizations, just other agencies in general. And this information is information such as the name of the organization, where they're located, if they have a fee for their services, their hours, all of their contact information. And that's developed into sort of a form, a survey, if you will. And there should be one or two people who are sort of gathering that information so it doesn't sort of disappear, so that there's someone who's continuing to monitor receipt of the information, so that ultimately you're not missing anything as far as the services that are available that would be incorporated into the resource guide. The next step is the victim experience survey, and that's who's really at the center of this in terms of ensuring safety and ensuring the future well-being of victims, and that would be the victim of domestic violence plus his or her children, and looking at how have they been impacted and the kind of needs they have, and generally that safety is number one. So we want to hear from victims. We want to know how are they being treated out there, and especially in the court system, and how can we learn from what they're telling us. So a core team that Kelly talked about would be the team that would develop the survey, and there are examples of victim experience surveys, and there's one, I believe, in the book that I mentioned earlier. This should be confidential. You don't really need the names of any victims unless they want to provide their names, but it should be confidential just for safety reasons and so forth. We're really wanting the information that they have that can help us as you move forward in developing protocols to see, how can the response be improved in terms of all areas related to a domestic violence court. And so that when it comes time to actually writing protocols, you take the information that you've garnered from the victim experience survey and incorporate those into the protocols. The next step is the community needs assessment. And this is, again, we want to ask the community how, their experiences about how different agencies or the impact of services in the community and how that's been for them. And so, again, this is another source of information that's going to help develop those protocols. So we want to ask things like, what services does the community require to meet the needs of domestic violence victims? What is it that they need? What would make things easier for them as a community agency, for example? As a victim, for example, if you have people who are coming to this community gathering, in the ones that I've seen done in different communities, they've had focus groups, for example, where they sometimes they would bring food, or they would mention in the flyer that there's going to be food. And anytime where there's Indian people gathering, sometimes it's important to have food. So it could be something very simple. But again, that's something that would draw the community, and other incentives as well, maybe door prizes or something, so that you are able to really get a good turnout for these community needs assessments, and to be able to hold them out into the community, because oftentimes it's difficult for people to travel any distance. So it's important to get out there into the communities, because some of those communities are pretty remote, and you really want a good cross-section of responses. And that way you're receiving information that's, again, going to inform the protocol development process, and how the Tribal Domestic Violence Court and the docket, or the docket, could meet those needs. So it's really important to really be as comprehensive as possible. So it can be done in a variety of ways, whether it's through public hearings, or focus groups, or community forums, and it also really gives you, I think, a good overall perspective on how the community feels about domestic violence, and hearing from people who've been impacted by this crime. And some of them have family members who have utilized the court system, and may have good feedback, or maybe not so good feedback. And all of that is really important to look at as protocols are being developed for a domestic violence tribal court docket. Forward. Once all this information is gathered, so you have your resources that you've received information on. You also have a good idea about the service providers out there from all of the different agencies, whether it's tribal, whether it's state, whether it's federal. And then you have also the feedback from victims, and that those victim experience surveys can be done maybe even as simple as sort of a card, sort of like a customer satisfaction card. So you're gathering just the really basic information, because that victim experience survey is going to continue to be utilized throughout this process, throughout this cyclical process, because you want to continue to receive feedback from victims. But it's a really good measure, and I should have said this back when I was talking about the victim experience survey. It's a really good measure to look at when you receive victim experience, those surveys and victim feedback at the beginning of this process, and then compare those results after protocols are in place, after this DV court has been in operation for a while, after people have been trained on the response protocols, to see if those the victim experiences have changed any. So again, you have the results of those now, and also the results from the community needs assessment, and then you have your mission statement. You also have the core values, and then just the guiding principles around confidentiality and safety measures for victims. So you have all of that gathered up to this point. From here, you want to look at who's going to actually do the writing for the protocols, and this can be done in a couple of different ways. I've seen it done where someone may draft for each discipline that's a part of this, to draft an initial draft of the protocols, and then submit that to their own disciplines to review and to look at and to receive input, to have meetings back at their agencies to say, this is a protocol that's going to ultimately go to a team that's going to adopt the protocol. We're going to adopt all of our protocols as a group. But this initial draft I've developed, and I would like feedback on it from within all of you within our agency. I've also seen it done where there's a group of writers that come together, maybe 2 or 3 from each discipline, to sit down and write, parts of their protocol and their how they respond to this crime of domestic violence within their agency. And then once that's done, then they take that to the overall team. So I've seen that done in a couple of different ways. Also, as the writing is starting to happen, it's also good to, gather other examples so you're not having to reinvent the wheel. Because I think there's, we also have access to some of those examples if people need. And then the drafting happens, and then that's taken, like I said, to the overall team, the multidisciplinary team, to share that with each other. And sometimes as you can use the team meeting agenda for each agency, each discipline, to present their protocols. And then as you present, then other disciplines can provide feedback to say, that's really good, or how about if you change this language, or is there a reason why you have that specific kind of language? Would you consider changing it here or there? So that other agencies can have input into each discipline's protocol in that regard. That's it for that one. So the I think this is Kelly's. Kelly?
I'm here. I was just trying to synthesize what you're saying there, Bonnie. And I would just say a couple of terms that we're sort of using interchangeably here. The core team is going to be equal to a multidisciplinary team. It's going to be comprised, if you go back and look at the other webinars, and we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, a variety of different disciplines that are going to be working on these cases as they progress through the tribal court. So I just wanted to point that out. And one of the things too that Bonnie and I have discussed at length in developing the webinar was the fact that we really feel it's best to, when you are having your core team meetings, to always separate out the writing and the adopting of the protocols so that one doesn't get overlooked. Obviously, if they're already written, but you still need to adopt them. And so we wanted to make sure that that was being separated out on your meeting agendas, just to make sure that one isn't overlooked. And when you're writing and adopting your protocols, these are really specifically connected to the structuring and implementation of a tribal domestic violence court or docket, that you identify who is being served. Is it going to be victims that are adults? Will it include victims who are perhaps minors but 17 or 18 years old? Will the court also serve the children of the victims? And when and how will they be served? Will they be served immediately upon referral to the tribal court? If so, how? Is there a person that's going to be designated at the tribal court that immediately contacts the tribal victim advocate, for example, and gets input on different service needs and begins to put those service providers, design that service delivery system that is meeting the needs of the victim as the victim's identifying those needs? Also, you need to be sure and identify in your tribal court protocol those services that are available and the gaps in services, and that's based on the information that you've already put together, that you've already reviewed according to what Bonnie's telling you in this 8-step process. And so that when the team opens these protocols, they're going to see those, and these gaps and services will change as time goes on. That's why it's so important in that 8-step process to always go back, revisit, repeat, and adjust this document. The protocol should also tell you exactly, give you the roadmap for how the target population is going to learn about the tribal domestic violence court or docket. Is this something that's going to be announced in those community meetings, that's what the community meetings are for? Will there be a formal announcement? Will there be flyers, brochures put out at different victim service agencies so they can hand these informational brochures to the victim? Really, we're going to get down in the weeds with this now, but how is the tribal population that this is going to serve going to know about the domestic violence court docket and the benefits and what types of cases and services this court or docket is going to provide? And that leads me into the next one. I'm getting ahead of myself. Identify exactly what kinds of cases the court's going to address. And let me give you an example. Is it going to be protection orders only, and it's civil in nature? Is it going to be protection orders, civil in nature, and protection order violations? Could be civil in nature, could be criminal. Is it going to be only civil cases, such as protection orders, divorce, custody, that involve domestic violence? The domestic violence is a common thread that's going to run through all of these cases. So what kinds of cases exactly is this court going to address? And you can start out with a more restrictive approach, saying we're only going to hear perhaps protection orders and protection order violations. And then as the court gets its feet under it and it becomes steady and sort of familiar with all the processes, then you can begin to expand your court. Some tribes may be ready to just do the whole thing now and do both civil and criminal cases that involve domestic violence. So just wanted to make sure that you're going to have to identify as a team what kinds of cases you're also going to address. You should also be sure to describe how the domestic violence cases will be identified by partners, by these service providers, and what is the referral process to the tribal court. Preferably something's going to be in writing to whoever at the tribal court's going to be receiving this information. There'll be some designation on the file that this is going to be a tribal domestic violence court case, and then the team will be meeting regularly, and service providers will be providing updates to the court, that sort of thing. So describing how these cases are going to be identified is that the domestic violence is going to be that working definition that you've already developed at this point earlier in the slides, according to your tribal community. And it's also going to engage we're hoping a whole lot of safety measures. So it's almost imperative that you have a tribal victim advocate on board immediately, that if the case is referred to the court knows the case is tagged, and the court knows to get that victim advocate engaged immediately for safety and service needs assessment. That's what the tribal victim advocate is an expert at. So also to identify in this protocol how the cases are going to be tracked through the court system. And I'm going to say that with just to give you a little bit of context. In domestic violence cases, whether they're civil or criminal, there seems to be, as a part of the power and control dynamic the batterer is attempting to exert over the victim, there's always continual motions to continue, and the case gets drug on, and hopefully by dragging the case on, the victim remains in a continual state of trauma. She's stressed, things are unstable, unsteady, and the batterer tends to utilize and manipulate the entire system to the batterer's benefit of maintaining power and control. So that's why it's so important that these cases are quickly identified, that there is this very specific protocol that these cases will be used to progress these cases through the court system by highly trained individuals that understand how batterers tend to want to use the court system to manipulate and to maintain power and control over the victim. So is it going to be, it could be something as simple as a colored dot that's going to go on the file. The files are all kept in a particular file cabinet. Or it can be very specific that one person at the court there is marking the cases, tracking the cases, and there may be some suggested deadlines. So if the case doesn't meet one of those suggested deadlines, then something is keyed as this case manager is reviewing the file. What's going on here? Is the system being utilized against the victim? So just making sure that we don't lose track of these cases and we minimize the opportunities a batterer has to manipulate this court system to maintain power and control. Some more things that you need to really define specifically in your tribal domestic violence court or docket protocols. Who's going to be this person we were just mentioning that's responsible for tagging this case and tracking this case? Is it going to be just one person at the tribal court? It could, depends on how large your court system is. Or will it be a team of people, perhaps court personnel and a tribal victim advocate? You decide what fits best to meet the needs of the tribal community that you're working with and for. How will judicial monitoring take place? As a judge, this is really important to me. I would be looking at these protocols to say, how often did this core team suggest I review this case? Because we all know that usually the attempts by the court through a court order to restrict or minimize a batterer's power and control over a victim is oftentimes met with a series of violations of the court order. And as a tribal court judge in a setting like this, I would be wanting to look at the protocols and say, what did the team feel was best as a review? And I'd sort of use that as my benchmark, knowing that I can have these reviews more often. And as the case progresses, and if the batterer's behaviors are becoming more and more compliant with the court orders, maybe the reviews would be occurring at further intervals apart. But this is going to be a really important step in your protocols, is making this. And don't forget, when you're addressing this judicial monitoring and how often it's going to take place, to leave the judge some discretion. Your judge at this point will, at some point here, before implementation of the tribal domestic violence court, will be hopefully a person, an individual who is trained in the power and control dynamics of domestic violence and how batterers like to manipulate the judicial system, the justice system, and will be up to date on all of this. But leave the judge some discretion here to make these periods longer or shorter as the judge deems necessary. Another very important issue is, how will these partners, these service providers, these core team members and other service providers who want to participate in this court movement, how will non-compliance of court orders or of the batterer's behaviors be reported to the tribal court? And one of the things for sure, and we mentioned this I think in webinar number 2, you never want to make the victim responsible for reporting non-compliance. That creates all sorts of danger, all sorts of safety issues for the victim. So have the partners, through the protocols, determine how the court will become aware of these non-compliant issues. Perhaps it's going to be at meetings, but again, the protocol needs to envision that there needs to be a paper trail, things put in writing. So there may be a referral note that goes to the court to alert the court with respect to the non-compliance issues. Then there are the safety issues just for the victim arriving at court, going into the court, being present in the court, and leaving the court. And a tribal victim advocate will be instrumental in helping develop safety protocols. A lot of things happen in the parking lot where families are all arriving for a trial, and it can get very heated. So we need to make sure that we have safety measures in place for the victim and the victim's children if they're going to be called. When will the cases be staffed? How often would the core team suggest that the entire team including the judge, they're going to sit down and staff the case. What's going well, what's not going well, any other needs that have arisen. So that needs to be sort of sketched out. Again, you could leave some discretion in there, but there needs to be some suggested deadlines, some benchmarks for these cases to be staffed. And then how will the team assist the court in identifying, because each case is going to be really different. So how's this team going to assist the court in determining what collaborative partners should be present at these case staffings, and how will we go about notifying these partners that their presence is being requested at a case staffing. So again, lots of decisions have to be made before or at least some ideas floating around and some discussions on what these particular pieces, how these pieces are going to fit into the protocols. Bonnie?
Okay, so now that protocols have been written, it's really important. The next step is to bring everyone on board to review them, like we've been saying, and also to agree to implementing the protocols, and those are called interagency agreements. And it sort of institutionalizes, I want to say, the implementation of the protocols, so that they're just not, you know, document that gets stored away or put on a shelf somewhere and to gather dust. That it's like at the very beginning we talked about it being a living document, that in order for it to be utilized and taken seriously, there needs to be some agreements that, number one, that people will adhere to the protocols that have been developed, because it's taken a lot of time and effort to develop these protocols. So the formal agreements, and it could be done in the form of MOUs from each agency, and it's generally signed by the person in the highest position of power. So, you know, like within law enforcement, the chief of police would be the person who would sign, and within an advocacy program, the executive director or the chairperson of the board, so that the highest official within each agency would sign. It sort of sends a message to that agency that this is taken seriously, that we're going to participate in this, that we're going to adhere to it, and that we're also potentially going to commit some resources. And it doesn't necessarily mean financial resources, unless of course there's some available, but looking at time on the part of each agency, yes, we will send representatives to the core team meetings, or, you know, we will, number one, we'll adhere to the protocols. We'll go by these protocols that have been established. And also things like we'll send our staff to training, and we'll participate in training each other. We'll participate in, you know, launching this to the community and sending a message to the community that this is a multidisciplinary effort. And so the MOU can include all sorts of information that each agency would sign on to. And it really, the interagency agreements are critical in that sense in the development of effective long-term relationships within that multidisciplinary approach, so that it's grounded in that concept that we're working together with these agreements in place, that ultimately within that it defines each of our roles and responsibilities to implement these protocols. And it's all, like we originally said, it's victim driven, it's victim centered, and it really looks at, you know, all the needs that have been gathered from the community and from victims as well, so that it's really been well thought out, and the information in there is ultimately going to improve the response to victims and create increased safety and offender accountability. The next step is the next step in the protocol development cycle is training, and this is really important because you know, the core team up to this point has been the group of individuals who've done the most work and who are most familiar with the protocols that have been developed. So the other people within their agencies also need to be trained and be aware of these protocols. Within the court system, you know, you have all sorts of individuals, court clerks, that you know, that also need to adhere to these protocols. So all of the agencies need to be trained, and that can be done in a variety of ways. It can be done within each agency. It can be done at core meetings where there's a series of team meetings, I should say, that are devoted just specifically to training on the protocols. And like I said earlier, that the head official of each agency, the top person in each agency is the one signing off and on the interagency agreements, which also stipulate that there's going to be training, and these trainings are mandatory for each agency and all of the individuals within that agency that encounter or work with victims of domestic violence. And of course, it's like I said, it's really difficult and challenging to accommodate scheduling, especially for under-resourced agencies where you know, you can't afford to send people to a lot of training. So however it can be done in the easiest way, it's important. I think the more frequent these trainings are held, then it provides an array of opportunities for agencies to be able to participate in the trainings, and then also to go on site to each of these agencies, I think is also important. There was a few agencies that video recorded one training, and that was shown at all of the different agencies' staff meetings, and then you know, a coordinator or one of the core team would accompany that video in order to answer questions about the protocols. So that was, I saw actually a few tribal communities who did it that way, just because it was hard to have in-person training for everyone to meet the needs. Okay.
Bonnie, can I add one thing?
Sure.
I wanted to add that when you get to the training, the writing of the training portion of the protocols, to incorporate not only the training for the protocols and how to implement the protocols, but also to include mandatory training time that each partner is going to attend some trainings on the power and control dynamics of domestic violence, and including some discipline-specific best practices as those are occurring in the domestic violence field. Because one of the things we hope to encourage is not only the smooth operation according to protocol here, but also that everyone is receiving periodic ongoing training with respect to that power and control dynamics of domestic violence, victim safety issues, and that.
Absolutely. You know, and because there's staff turnover in any agency, it's also important to have these trainings periodically, so that that training continues, so everyone is on board and sort of on the same page as far as understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and the critical importance of ensuring safety for victims. Forward. So the next step is monitoring, and this can be done in a variety of ways. You know, I've seen it done where there's some discussion at each core team meeting or on the team's agenda to look at how are these protocols, are they being properly implemented? What are the gaps? What are we missing? Are there things that are being overlooked? And also to look at, are the protocols achieving the desired results that we intended when we developed the protocols? Are they still in keeping with what was identified within our focus groups, within those community needs assessments that we did, or within the victim experience surveys? And if not, how can we tweak those protocols? How can we tweak what we already have in order to make them more effective to meet the needs that have been identified? So this monitoring also has to be an ongoing process. And because, like we said again, it's a living, breathing document, and always to be improved upon as time progresses. And it's a learning experience as well across disciplines to learn more about each discipline's role and each discipline's responsibility, and also to look at where we come together and those services are provided simultaneously, and how is it that we're still able to maintain our roles, for example, or where does it become confusing? And even in terms of information sharing, how is that being done, and how, so that information doesn't fall through the cracks that would ultimately provide danger to victims, for example. Okay. The last step is called well, I shouldn't say the last step. Well, in the process overall is evaluation. So anytime you're utilizing a process like this, it's important to really look at, to have a more formalized way of monitoring what you're doing. So you're not just monitoring, but you're actually saying, okay, so we've learned from our monitoring process that this is critical, how our team is performing and how these protocols are being utilized. And that can be done in a variety of ways. Some teams have decided to utilize an outside evaluator, and that's, again, based on resources that they may have to pay an evaluator. But it's important, if you are using an evaluator, that it's someone who's familiar with domestic violence and also tribal court systems, so that they're able to effectively evaluate based on the protocols that were developed. And a positive evaluation is also good. We're looking at gaps. We're looking at problems, areas that may be problematic. But we also, a positive evaluation can also justify the need for a tribal domestic violence court docket, and perhaps even leverage resources to maintain the court, because you're looking at, we've done this, we've developed protocols, we've been practicing it or implementing these protocols for a year now, and it's gone really well. However, we need financial resources. So you can use the data and the outcomes and your evaluation as a way to seek funding, for example. And overall, it's evaluating the protocols. It's evaluating not only the services that have been provided, but also how the team is functioning. And so it's sort of a twofold process. So you should also plan on designing a process to measure at least three things: the extent to which the system problems have been improved or eliminated. However much time you want to allow for that is really up to the team. I've seen where some may take it as within increments of 6 months. It seems like a year is often a little too long to wait to be able to really look at the process. And number two, the extent to which victims feel supported and safe through the process. So again, that a victim experience survey that we talked about earlier can be utilized at this time. The extent to which the tribal domestic violence court docket has improved the tribal response to incidents of domestic violence. So to look at how, internally, how do you all feel about how these protocols have helped the response within the courts and within each agency.
And this is the last of the substantive slides, and then Chia will begin to go through some of the resources that we have for you. But this is a very important step. It's important enough that we felt that it really needed to be a step in and of itself, and which made more than 8 steps. But just to make you all aware, we're aware of that. And this is the repeat, because as Bonnie said, this is cyclical in nature. And if you forget this last step, what you have developed will grow stale eventually. This repeat step is going to establish regular periodic meetings between the core team partners and regular and ongoing protocol sort of reviews as we've set forth in this 8-step process. And it also allows just to serve as a reminder that oftentimes when we do reviews, there may be modifications that are needed to the protocols, and that's because it's very difficult to get a perfect work product the first time, and the needs and the gaps are going to be continually shifting and changing. So again, just to underscore, this last step is probably as important as the first one. It can't be overstated, and it's going to ensure that these lovely protocols and policies that you all have developed to address this hideous issue that's occurring in Indian country, that being domestic violence, that it's going to be continually updated and reflecting these best practices as we begin to continue to learn in the field serving victims of domestic violence.
Kelly?
Yes.
Can I just add something?
Yes.
It sounds like an awful lot. It's like, oh my God, we did all this and now we're going to go back over and do it all again. But it really goes a lot quicker because the substantive information that has been gathered within each step has already been gathered. So as you go back around, it isn't as, in some steps, you may not even really need to be as thorough or as, spend as much time, for example, with the community or with the victim, what is that called? The services, the resources that exist. Those generally aren't going to change a whole lot. You may have to update it in case an agency has moved or whatever. But again, because you're using that resource for, to make referrals to victims, it's important to keep that current. With the victim experience survey, that's an ongoing thing. And again, like I said, it can be as simple as kind of a card, like a customer satisfaction card per se, where you're just continuing to get victim feedback about how their experience was within the court system. And so as you move forward, each of these steps aren't going to take as long, but it's really important to continue revisiting each one to see what can be tweaked, what can be improved upon. So it's going to go much more quicker than the first time around. I just wanted to add that just because it sounds really cumbersome to do it all over again.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie and Kelly. Right now, I will just quickly go over some resources that TLPI has. As Kelly mentioned earlier in the webinar, we have a Tribal Law and Policy Institute sexual assault response team manual. So this is a resource guide to develop a sexual assault response team in tribal communities, and this can be found on it's www.home.tlpi.org. And I think even if you go onto the tlpi.org, you should be able to get referred over to this. But we house all our publications on the home.tlpi.org website, and this is available for free, and you can download it. We also have a couple tribal legal code resources that are relevant to domestic violence. One is our tribal laws implementing TLOA, the Tribal Law and Order Act Enhanced Sentencing, and the Violence Against Women Act Enhanced Jurisdiction, the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction over Non-Indians. And our other legal code resource is for domestic violence laws, guide for drafting or revising victim-centered tribal laws against domestic violence. And again, both of those are found on our website if you go to home.tlpi.org, and both are free and you can download those. We also have a website, tribalprotectionorder.org, with some good information on drafting protection orders, enforcing them, and other resources. And some more information on the VAWA Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. If you go to NCAI's website, they have a lot of great resources, including the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction Pilot Project Report and the newly released Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction 5-year report, which has great updated information and statistics on the tribes who have been exercising. And here are some more TLPI resources. Our websites are up here, the Tribal Court Clearinghouse, and then, as I mentioned, the home website with most of our publications on there, and sex trafficking resources. So please feel free to look at those and download those. I believe everything's pretty much free except for maybe our Sharing Our Stories of Survival, which is available for purchase. With that, I would like to open it up for questions. I don't see any right now. So I will just say, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I can get it to Bonnie and Kelly. Oh, look, okay, we have a question here. This person did not get to attend the 2 last webinars, and our webinars are available that have been recorded already, including the 2 previous ones on the Tribal Court Clearinghouse. It's www.tlpi.org. And if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, there should say, I think it's maybe the 3rd or 4th down, but it's on the right-hand side of the screen. It should say webinars. And they want to receive more information on the SART protocols. And Kelly and Bonnie, those would be within the SART manual. Is that correct?
Yes.
So if you want to take a look at the SART manual on the home.tlpi.org, there's the manual there. And if you have any questions about it, please feel free to contact me and I can get you in touch with Bonnie or Kelly. I don't see any other webinars, excuse me, any other questions on the webinar. So again, I will put this recording will be up on the website probably by Monday, hopefully by this afternoon. And I will also send out the slides for the webinar to you all. And Kelly or Bonnie, is there, oh, here we go, another question. Where is the best place to go find training for judges? Kelly, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Okay, well, the best place I can think about would be, of course, any training that's sanctioned by the Office of Violence Against Women. I would look for those. It just so happens that judges tend to like to go to training with other judges, and if that's the case, you might look at OVW sanctioned or funded, approved courses at the National Center on Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and or the name escapes me, in Reno, the National Center.
The National Center for, oh gosh, National Judicial Training Center, is that NJTC? Well, if you look at the National Judicial College, also they work in conjunction. My brain is not.
Yes, mine either. But I would look for those, and I think I'm just going to go out on a limb and say this. This is my own personal opinion, which it is not worth much to anybody but me. But I'm just saying, I think it's a red flag if you have judges that are working in this area, such as a tribal domestic violence court or docket. If you have judges that refuse or are hesitant, always pushing back on obtaining training, that should send a message to you that perhaps that's not the right individual to be working on this team on these very complex, highly lethal cases. So, I mean, you're looking around for someone who's really willing and ready to go to training. You can never get trained too much. It never hurts to have your memories refreshed, how to write protection orders properly, enforceable protection orders, being trained on that. I'm just telling you that you really need to have someone who's ready to hit the ground running with respect to attending trainings on this issue.
The National Judicial College, I just looked that up. That's one of the other ones besides the National Council and Juvenile Family Court Judges. Both of those have a lot of courses, and the National Judicial College also has a tribal-specific training as well.
And we want to be sure, can we make sure we're getting the UW stamp of approval on the trainings? That's the way that we're going to know that they're, that they're really tailored for domestic violence victims.
Yes. Another question here, how successful have tribes been on implementing cultural elements of restorative justice into DV protocol and policy?
We'll let Bonnie answer that one.
I haven't really, I haven't seen any reports or anything formal. A lot of what I've received is anecdotal information, and I also have my own feelings about restorative justice. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in tribal communities around the dynamics of domestic violence and what's going to restore the trauma that's been that a victim feels after being battered, the psychological impact, and then you add historic trauma also to that. I don't know that there's any way to adequately restore a victim with payment or, because unless we hold offenders, we're able to hold offenders accountable to the full extent of our, whether it's tribal justice or other means, I just think that there's some dangers and some potential pitfalls that could harm a victim of domestic violence through the use of restorative justice. That's personal and some anecdotal information as well.
Thanks, Bonnie. We had a follow-up question for you, Kelly, that if they paid for the training, would you be able to or willing to come to Fort Hall to do training? So I can put you two in contact with each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't see any other questions right now. I would just like to ask everyone, when the webinar ends, there will be a pop-up that shows, there's just 2 quick questions about the webinar. If you could please take just a couple minutes to answer those, would be great. Since I don't see any other questions, I would like to encourage you all, if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me and I can get those to Kelly and Bonnie. And again, I'll get the webinar PowerPoint out to everybody, and thank you all for joining and taking time out of your day to listen into our webinar. And everybody have a great weekend. And thank you, Kelly and Bonnie, for presenting.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.